voice would be significantly weakened. And as John has said, the Americans have made it very clear that one of the reasons that we have such a special relationship with them is because we are a bridge, if you like, to the rest of the EU, and we're a very valuable partner being in the EU. Now, let me just say something about where I think EU foreign policy has been a success and where it hasn't been a success. I want to choose two different examples, one that sort of overlaps with John, but let me first say something about Somalia. I think that in terms of the European External Action Service and Cathy Ashton's role, there has been real success in pushing back and reducing piracy in Somalia. For the first time last year, there were no piracy attacks in Somalia. The Al-Shabaab militia was pushed back. There was the first democratic elected government in Somalia for 25 years. The EU is working alongside an African peacekeeping force who are being trained by European forces. And I think that this is an area of the world where the EEAS, despite its weird acronym, has shown that it really does have value. And the second example is Iran, because I do think Cathy has done a tremendous job in keeping together what is a broad alliance of the EU, UK, China and Russia in the talks with Iran. She has very much led those talks. And obviously, when you talk about success in terms of Iran, that's a very difficult thing to measure. And I'm not saying that they've been ultimately successful, because obviously they haven't, but she's kept those talks ongoing. They are fairly constructive. It's difficult to predict how they will go in terms of any conclusion, but I do think for the time being, in terms of success in Iran, if you can call it that, it's relatively good going. However, saying that, there are many conflicts in which the EU is divided, not least Libya, where Germany abstained in its vote in the UN, and France and the UK very much took the lead. But also, elephant in the room, Iraq was incredibly divisive. And I think less so, but still in people's minds, less so than it was 2 or 3 years ago. And I, like John, think that this area of policy making should not be an area where we have qualified majority voting. This is essentially an area where the EU is only strong if it can agree. And if it can't agree, then we can't just have a sort of breakaway group acting by qualified majority voting. I just don't think that works. I think the Guido Westerwelle report that suggested this was, maybe certain other elements of it were considered more serious, but I think many people dismissed this element of that report. And I think the other area where we might see development, and it might seem antithetical as a British politician to say this, but I do think we need to recognise that there are severe pressures on defence budgets, not only in the UK, which is overall reducing its budget by, where's the figure? Something like 7%, 7.5% over 4 years, but in other member states, those cuts are even more severe, in some cases 10 to 20%. And I do think that if we are pragmatic about this, there is an area here in which the EU could cooperate more closely and pool its resources, and that certain member states that have strengths in certain areas of military and defence technology could start to lead in those areas and let other member states lead in other areas. I certainly think that's an area that could be pushed more vigorously. I know obviously Tony Blair, when he was in government, alongside Jacques Chirac, was keen to have more cooperation on this. Now, this is obviously a sensitive area because defence is always very much, an area where sovereign states like to have their own capabilities. But I think some of the smaller and medium-sized member states, the Czech Republic, for example, apparently has some very good technology with regard to how you deal with chemical and biological weapons. Why not let the Czech Republic specialise in that area? That could be useful to us if it, in certain conflicts. So that's an area where I think that we could explore. just to answer all the three questions, Sophie, the first question, a European Foreign Ministry, no, certainly not one that's called a European Foreign Ministry. As John has said, a lot of the semantics were discussed when the high-level rep was created. I think that it will depend on who takes over, and I think it will depend whether EU member states, when they sit down in about a year's time, are thinking, should we go for sort of the lowest common denominator? Should we go for a sort of small member state that doesn't do much in this area and sort of weakens our role in this area? Or do we go for one of the big 3 or 4? You know, it will depend on the individual as to how much power they have within the Commission and within the Council. And as John has said, it wasn't an easy thing to sort of build. And having spent 6 years in Brussels, I'm well aware of the turf wars. And they are not just political between left and right, and there is that too. They're also institutional, and they're also inter-institutional. So on that note about turf wars, that I think will be won. Not to dwell too much on the word war, I will conclude. Thank you.
And Reynolds, thank you very much.
Thank you. Interesting week in which to talk about the British government's approach to Europe. I am a Liberal Democrat in the Foreign Office, but I'm speaking here, of course, for the coalition government. What I first want to say is that in shared foreign policy, you have to learn to walk before you can run. The British government and the French walk very vigorously on European foreign policy. Others insist that we should start running, but they want to run on the spot. That seems to me to be, in a sense, the Westphalian report. We don't want to go anywhere, but we think we should be sort of doing something somehow. Years ago, when we were discussing this, I remember a senior French diplomat saying to me, of course, a common foreign policy is a shared foreign policy complementary to national foreign policies. It is not a single foreign policy. If we were to have a single foreign policy, it would be, he said, a single chair for Europe, but empty. A single voice, but silent. And that was a French diplomat.
In French.
Oh, absolutely. I just think it's worth remembering part of the reason for the current surge of scepticism in Britain about the European Union, because it relates to what we're discussing now. One is that the European Commission is pressing national governments as part of the Troika to cut budgets, to cut salaries of civil servants in some countries, and at the same time, the European Commission and the European Parliament are now trying to unpick the multi-annual financial framework by insisting on very large draft amending budgets to increase their expenditure. At the present moment, it's very hard in any contributing member state to make the case for expanding the European External Action Services budget or any other budget in Brussels. You have to recognise that's part of the reality we're up against. Secondly, I hear people saying, well, the Eurozone is making all sorts of wrong decisions, and it's making them, in any case, far too slowly. If the majority of member states of the European Union can't take key decisions in good time on such a central element as the future of the European economy, then one should at least hesitate to say, and we can jump straight on to take decisions which in a crisis have to be taken very rapidly on foreign policy and security policy. That doesn't suggest that we have much room for confidence. And then, of course, the third element is the question of democratic legitimacy, in which the absence of any shared sense of national security, external threats, role in the world, that's strong enough across the 27, shortly 28 member states to form the basis for common foreign policy. It should also just give us leave to pause. We have, after all, gone through the effort to draft a statement in 2003 on a common European security and defence strategy. It was drafted largely by a British diplomat, at British and French initiative. No national government wanted to have a debate about it within their national domestic context. I think the Finnish Parliament had a short committee inquiry on it, and that's about as far as any of them went. We tried to revise that strategy document in 2008, French initiative under their presidency, and most member governments, including those that are most enthusiastic about a common foreign policy, thought it was too delicate to talk about, what are we doing in foreign and security policy? They didn't want to discuss that. And this year, we are coming up for the December European Council to discuss the common foreign and defence policy, and the suggestion has again been floated by the French government that we might revise the document on what an overall European strategy should be. And there is deep reluctance from a large number of member governments which proclaim that they are committed to a common foreign policy, actually to discussing what a common foreign policy should be about. If that's still the case, then we have some real problems. I was at a conference in another member state last week, at which a senior official attacked the British and French governments for being the main obstacles to a common foreign policy. I had to point out that we provide nearly half defence spending. We do a great deal of the external work, the E3+3 framework on Iran, including the High Representative, that's Britain, France, and Germany, together with Russia, China, and the United States, is proving a very useful vehicle through which we operate. I hear my Secretary of State say regularly, so long as the E3 stay together, we can do X, Y, or Z. That's serious shared foreign policy covering serious shared interests. The United Kingdom has actually, through successive governments of different complexions, put a great deal into trying to develop closer cooperation in foreign policy. I go back to the London report, which Lord Carrington wrote in, was it 1980 or 1981, and the efforts which we put in after the San Marno initiative of Tony Blair in 1998 to push